Waldron's house on the moors. The captain is described as a clever, determined fellow, of the daring, piratical sort, with the dash of mystery about him that women like. "She's not the same as other women," interposed Mr. Bashwood, suddenly interrupting his son. "Did she?" His voice failed him, and he stopped without bringing the question to an end. "Did she like the captain?" suggested Bashwood the younger, with another laugh. "According to her own account of it, she adored him. At the same time, her conduct, as represented by herself, was perfectly innocent, considering how carefully her husband watched her. The statement, incredible as it appears, is probably true. For 6 weeks or so they confined themselves to corresponding privately, the Cuban captain, who spoke and wrote English perfectly, having contrived to make a go-between of one of the female servants in the Yorkshire house. How it might have ended we needn't trouble ourselves to inquire. Mr. Waldron himself brought matters to a crisis. Whether he got wind of the clandestine correspondence or not, doesn't appear, but this is certain, that he came home from a ride one day in a fiercer temper than usual, that his wife showed him a sample of that high spirit of hers which he had never yet been able to break, and that it ended in his striking her across the face with his riding-whip. Ungentlemanly conduct, I am afraid we must admit, but, to all outward appearance, the riding-whip produced the most astonishing results. From that moment the lady submitted as she had never submitted before. For a fortnight afterward, he did what he liked, and she never thwarted him. He said what he liked, and she never uttered a word of protest. Some men might have suspected this sudden reformation of hiding something dangerous under the surface. Whether Mr. Waldron looked at it in that light, I can't tell you. All that is known is that, before the mark of the whip was off his wife's face, he fell ill, and that in 2 days afterward he was a dead man. What do you say to that?" "I say he deserved it," answered Mr. Bashwood, striking his hand excitedly on the table, as his son paused and looked at him. "The doctor who attended the dying man was not of your way of thinking," remarked Bashwood the younger, dryly. "He called in 2 other medical men, and they all 3 refused to certify the death. The usual legal investigation followed. The evidence of the doctors, and the evidence of the servants, pointed irresistibly in one and the same direction, and Mrs. Waldron was committed for trial, on the charge of murdering her husband by poison. A solicitor in first-rate criminal practice was sent for from London to get up the prisoner's defense, and these instructions took their form and shape accordingly. What's the matter? What do you want now?" Suddenly rising from his chair, Mr. Bashwood stretched across the table, and tried to take the papers from his son. "I want to look at them," he burst out eagerly. "I want to see what they say about the captain from Cuba. He was at the bottom of it, Jemmy. I'll swear he was at the bottom of it." "Nobody doubted who was in the secret of the case at the time," rejoined his son, "but nobody could prove it. Sit down again, Dad, and compose yourself. There's nothing here about Captain Manuel but the lawyer's private suspicions of him, for the counsel to act on or not, at the counsel's discretion. From first to last she persisted in screening the captain. At the outset of the business she volunteered 2 statements to the lawyer, both of which he suspected to be false. In the first place, she declared that she was innocent of the crime. He wasn't surprised, of course, so far. His clients were, as a general rule, in the habit of deceiving him in that way. In the second place, while admitting her private correspondence with the Cuban captain, she declared that the letters on both sides related solely to a proposed elopement, to which her husband's barbarous treatment had induced her to consent. The lawyer naturally asked to see the letters. "He has burned all my letters, and I have burned all his," was the only answer he got. It was quite possible that Captain Manuel might have burned her letters when he heard there was a coroner's inquest in the house. But it was in her solicitor's experience, as it is in my experience too, that when a woman is fond of a man, in 99 cases out of 100, risk or no risk, she keeps his letters. Having his suspicions roused in this way, the lawyer privately made some inquiries about the foreign captain, and found that he was as short of money as a foreign captain could be. At the same time, he put some questions to his client about her expectations from her deceased husband. She answered, in high indignation, that a will had been found among her husband's papers, privately executed only a few days before his death, and leaving her no more, out of all his immense fortune, than £5,000. "Was there an older will, then," says the lawyer, "which the new will revoked?" Yes, there was. A will that he had given into her own possession. A will made when they were first married. Leaving his widow well provided for? Leaving her just 10 times as much as the second will left her. Had she ever mentioned that first will, now revoked, to Captain Manuel? She saw the trap set for her, and said, "No, never," without an instant's hesitation. That reply confirmed the lawyer's suspicions. He tried to frighten her by declaring that her life might pay the forfeit of her deceiving him in this matter. With the usual obstinacy of women, she remained just as immovable as ever. The captain, on his side, behaved in the most exemplary manner. He confessed to planning the elopement. He declared that he had burned all the lady's letters as they reached him, out of regard for her reputation. He remained in the neighborhood, and he volunteered to attend before the magistrates. Nothing was discovered that could legally connect him with the crime, or that could put him into court on the day of the trial, in any other capacity than the capacity of a witness. I don't believe myself that there's any moral doubt, as they call it, that Manuel knew of the will which left her mistress of £50,000, and that he was ready and willing, in virtue of that circumstance, to marry her on Mr. Waldron's death. If anybody tempted her to effect her own release from her husband by making herself a widow, the captain must have been the man; and unless she contrived, guarded, and watched as she was, to get the poison for herself, the poison must have come to her in one of the captain's letters. "I don't believe she used it, if it did come to her," exclaimed Mr. Bashwood. "I believe it was the captain himself who poisoned her husband." Bashwood the younger, without noticing the interruption, folded up the instructions for the defense, which had now served their purpose, put them back in his bag, and produced a printed pamphlet in their place. "Here is one of the published reports of the trial," he said, "which you can read at your leisure if you like. We needn't waste time now by going into details. I have told you already how cleverly your counsel paved his way for treating the charge of murder as the crowning calamity of the many that had already fallen on an innocent woman. The two legal points relied on for the defense, after this preliminary flourish, were, first, that there was no evidence to connect her with the possession of poison; and, secondly, that the medical witnesses, while positively declaring that her husband had died by poison, differed in their conclusions as to the particular drug that had killed him. Both good points, and both well worked, but the evidence on the other side bore down everything before it. The prisoner was proved to have had no less than 3 excellent reasons for killing her husband. He had treated her with almost unexampled barbarity. He had left her in a will, unrevoked so far as she knew, mistress of a fortune on his death; and she was, by her own confession, contemplating an elopement with another man. Having set forth these motives, the prosecution next showed by evidence, which was never once shaken on any single point, that the one person in the house who could by any human possibility have administered the poison was the prisoner at the bar. What could the judge and jury do with such evidence before them as this? The verdict was guilty, as a matter of course, and the judge declared that he agreed with it. The female part of the audience was in hysterics, and the male part was not much better. The judge sobbed, and the bar shuddered. She was sentenced to death in such a scene as had never been previously witnessed in an English court of justice. And she is alive and hearty at the present moment, free to do any mischief she pleases, and to poison, at her own entire convenience, any man, woman, or child that happens to stand in her way. A most interesting woman! Keep on good terms with her, my dear sir, whatever you do,